Okay, show of hands. How many people just get really confused when you look down here? Okay, so the reason I described CV, and we talked about CV and gate and all of that information, is when you think about CV, there's a source and there's a destination. It's coming from something and going to somewhere. This thing is changing this thing. So that's the basics. When you're talking about controlling or connecting up CV or any gates or CV, something is going somewhere to change that thing or to send audio to that thing. So there's always a source and a destination. So when you look down here at Thor, and in this area here, what do you see? Source, destination. The same thing. This area is basically a big modular synthesizer with a lot of cables waiting for you to patch it. But it's text-based instead of graphic-based. But this makes Thor actually a fully modular synthesizer. Even though we call it semi-modular, that means that certain things have already been patched and you can easily make a sound without having to know what the hell you're doing, which is good. But when you know what the hell you're doing, or at least want to attempt to know what the hell you're doing, which is what I try to do, still learning, this gives you some really, really cool options and gives you a lot of flexibility with sound. So let's do this. And just to clarify, to not get confused, these are all the same thing. All you're getting is different ways of moving things around. So here you've got one source, one destination, I'll explain the scale in a second, and an amount. Here you've got one source to two destinations. So that's using that splitter analogy, right? One source goes to two different places. So it's a little more flexibility with scale. And then here you've got one source, one destination, with two different things that can scale it. I'll show you scale in a second, but first let's get into this. So what I want to do is I want to route some things here and do some interesting stuff. So let's start with the Maelstrom first. We've got these modulators right here. Let me just see how I put it on time, okay. We've got these modulators with different waveforms. These are LFOs, low frequency oscillator. So they give you different waveform types which are sending data or sending information. And depending on the waveform that you selected, that information is coming out in different ways, whether it be sine or stepped or random or slew, things like that, okay? So normally these are going to do things like, let's say if we select this sine wave, and we'll just actually auto-route this. So if I play this, there's my sine wave on the Maelstrom, and if I then make this change pitch, so you can hear what the waveform is doing. So what you're hearing is this sine wave being modulated by that. All fine and good, okay? But we don't want that. What I want to do is I actually want to hear what that waveform sounds like if I were to listen to the CV. So I'm going to remove the Maelstrom from there. I'm going to take mod output, mod A, which is a CV output, and I'm going to connect it to CV input 1 on the Thor. And when I do that, I hear nothing. That's because these inputs right over here, audio input and the modulation inputs, all of these inputs are there, and they're connected, but you got to tell them where to go. And that's where this comes into play. So even though I've connected something into Thor, and this works if you connect audio into Thor too, you got to tell it where to go. So I'm going to say my source at this point is CV input number 1, and my destination is filter 3 left in. Now, if I do that, I'm only going to get one side. Right? But I want to actually have it be for both sides. So instead of it doing over to here, I'm going to do my source over here to be CV input number 1. And I'm going to set it to destination filter 3 left and filter 3 right. See, that's where this comes in handy. Otherwise, I would have had to do this twice and say CV input left, then CV input, then right. See, so that's why we made those other sections, to just, for scenarios like this, make it simpler. Now, of course, in order to hear it, you've got to turn it up. So we'll give our value of 100. Now, why did I use filter 3? Because filter 3 is in the global section, and it's always on. I don't have to trigger a node in Thor or anything like that. It's just on, it's passing audio. So now we're hearing this guy. And as I turn my rate up, some fun, interesting stuff that we've got here. So we're listening to the sound of CV. Fun stuff, huh? Now, let's cover a scale. So right now this is always on, and that's kind of annoying. So if I want to be able to turn that on and off and decide when it comes in and when it comes out, I want to assign something to let this happen, something to tell this to actually happen. And that's what scale is. Scale allows you to assign something to decide when this happens and by how much. So if I set scale to modifier button 1 and give it 100%, anytime I push button 1, now I hear it. When I don't push button 1 or turn it off, I don't hear it. So that's scale. And that could be a button, it could be a knob, it could be a keyboard, it could be a modulation wheel, what have you. All right, so we've got that loop going. And what I'm going to do now is create an effect. I'll let you hear an effect that I made, which uses a fair amount of CV to do some interesting things. One thing is, you notice that there's a flip-flop going on with mixer channels. And then you'll notice there's some BV512 vocoders being fed by subtractors, and there's nothing triggering notes here anywhere. And that's because I'm using CV and LFOs to be the note and trigger notes within these. So what you're going to hear, I'm not hearing it yet. I'm going to turn it on. So these two are being swapped back and forth, and there's a slight change in the pattern that's being played. And the way I'm swapping back and forth is by triggering notes on a keyboard being sent to the mixer. Because the mixer, the 14x2 mixer, when you play notes on the keyboard, they can do things like solo or mute channels. So I'm actually triggering the combinator from itself, right here, being triggered from a Thor step sequencer, note and gate. And when you look at that Thor, you can see the note and gate is just C0 and D0. C0 being solo channel 1, D0 being solo channel 2. And then the actual notes that are being fed to these subtractors, you notice there's a gate and CV input, and those are coming from these spiders, which are being fed from the curve output of this Thor, and also coming from the modulation output, which is the CV input, which is coming from a rotary. So there's some odd stuff going. It's not, again, no notes are being sent. It's all CV that's being sent to change the notes that you're hearing. And then there's an alternate pattern. And because there's no notes in the CV, there's some odd little bum notes in there, but I kind of like it. It's fine. So you see a little bit of where you can go when you start diving into working with some CV and some gates and really getting tweaky with some modulation. You can get some really unusual and unique sounds out of Reason and really expand your sonic palette. And of course, then you could do the basic stuff like tremolo and autopan and all that stuff, but then you can go beyond into some pretty advanced territory.